Hi, it's story time. Well, we've been following over the past 6 months the progress of the new Toledo Police Museum, which is under development and soon to open now within a matter of weeks. And tonight, an update.
Well, I started here in Toledo in about 1972. Was my first foray into news and doing that sort of thing on radio. I was at the old WOHO radio station, 1470, which is now, I think, WLQR AM. And, but I didn't start here. I actually started earlier in Iowa and then Utah. I'd worked for a couple of years before I came back home to Toledo. Back in those years, everybody said, Toledo was too big of a market to start in for radio. You couldn't get your start necessarily here. Everybody said, go to a small town, make your mistakes. So I did. I ended up going to a couple of small markets in Iowa and Utah and, made plenty of mistakes there. But you learn, after a couple of years, you become comfortable doing what you're doing, and then moved back to town and started working at WOHO in the newsroom. And of course, that was back in the days when we had like 5 radio stations, at least in this market, that all had active newsrooms and news operations, where we had 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people at times. I mean, you wouldn't go to a news conference without seeing 3 or 4 radio stations there. They were just as active, if not more active, than the TV stations. So it was a different time, and people were very active in radio news back then. So I stayed with radio news here in the market, and then in 1977 was offered a job in Detroit at WXYZ, which at that time was an ABC O&O radio. And so I went up there, spent a couple of years up there, and that's where I worked on the investigative series that won the Peabody Award in 1978, which was on the series of child killings that happened up in Oakland County. But then I was given an offer to move back to Toledo into television in the late 70s, 79, and then I came back here and worked for Channel 24 for a couple of years, and then found my way to Colorado and ended up out there, and then actually came back, really didn't come back here until the 90s, and then began working, because in between I was working a lot in Denver, working in different TV stations and radio stations out there, and moved around the country a little bit. But I came back here in the 90s and worked at Channel 11 as a reporter. And that's when I'd really not done that much TV reporting. I had done some in Denver, and I really liked it. But coming back here and doing television was really the first time I'd done TV reporting. And I said, that's when I really developed the love and appreciation for the history and the heritage and the things that were very, very Toledo, as I always called them. The things that you couldn't find in any other market. The things that were uniquely Toledo. And that's when I really fell in love with my hometown. It wasn't really until about 20 years ago when I came back and began to sort of rediscover things that I didn't know existed here. And when you start to all of a sudden, just traveling through the neighborhoods and seeing things that maybe you heard about, or you start looking at buildings differently and realizing, oh, that building is where this took place. Or, I remember doing the story on the Autolite strike from 1934. And we were doing sort of a retrospective on that, and going back over to where the old Autolite building was still in existence at that time, and taking a look at it, and then taking a look at the old pictures and the old video from the strike, and then trying to piece it all together. Okay, there's Chestnut Hill. There's the battle that took place, and this is where the National Guard came in, and you start to all of a sudden you can really visualize it. So you start doing that more and more, and I really got into that. That became a real passion for me at that point to develop the, sort of my own sense of Toledo in this. And so when I drive down the street of Toledo, any of the streets of the neighborhoods, I don't see it as it sort of exists today. I sometimes see it as it existed. I'll drive down Monroe Street and say, oh, okay, that's the apartment building where the FBI nabbed Harry Campbell on the morning of such and such in 1934. Right there, it's still there, So I'm constantly looking for those historical little landmarks that sort of speak to Toledo. And that's kind of how I see Toledo.